The night air around the cathedral was still, as if the world itself had held its breath in reverence. Inside, the cold stone walls of the ancient structure absorbed the moonlight that filtered in through fractured stained glass. At the heart of it, kneeling before the grand altar, was Jacqueline. Her eyes, icy and dark, were closed in deep prayer, lips silently forming the words of a faith most vampires had long abandoned. The flicker of candlelight illuminated her porcelain skin, casting her in an ethereal glow, as if she were not of this earth. And she wasn't. Not anymore. The cathedral was silent, but the tension in the air was thick. The vampire wasn't simply praying, she was waiting. The echo of footsteps broke the tranquility. The clack of boots on stone reverberated through the church, a stark intrusion into the sanctity of the space. Jacqueline's eyes opened slowly, her mouth closing with the final whisper of her prayer. She remained kneeling for a long moment before standing gracefully, turning to face the newcomer. Stephanie strode down the aisle at odds with the divine surroundings. She was defiant, unbothered by the sacred space she had intruded upon. She was not long for this new life, still more mortal than monster, yet she walked as if she owned the world. Jacqueline's eyes narrowed at her approach. The disappointment was palpable.
Do you understand where you stand?
In a church. I thought vampires were supposed to burn in places like this. Guess that's a lie too.
The corner of Jacqueline's lips twitched, with a hint of irritation. Stephanie's gaze moved around the cathedral, her casual demeanor unshaken.
Do you really believe in all this? God and all that?
Her voice was tinged with genuine curiosity, as if the concept was so foreign to her that she needed to hear it aloud to believe it.
And do you not?
Stephanie laughed, a sharp sound that echoed too loudly in the hallowed space.
Ha 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 ha. Why would I? After everything, all of this. There's no God in this.
For a moment, silence hung between them like a tangible weight. Jacqueline's expression softened, not with warmth, but with something deeper, something older.
My sister was a nun once. She could perform miracles.
The words hung in the air, unexpected.
Before this curse, before the blood, she healed the sick, gave comfort to the dying. Her faith was unshakable.
Jacqueline's eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the church walls, something lost in the folds of time.
And it remained so even after she became what we are. She believed that this...
Jacqueline gestured subtly to herself, to her vampiric nature.
...was a test from God, a trial of faith.
Stephanie shifted uncomfortably.
And you? You believe that?
Jacqueline's gaze sharpened again, the moment of vulnerability closing like a trapdoor.
My faith has never wavered.
Before Stephanie could respond, her sire's tone turned colder, like the bite of frost.
But that is not why you're here.
With a swift movement, the older vampire stepped forward, her presence suddenly overwhelming. She looked down at Stephanie, her eyes glinting with disapproval.
You were weak in battle. You failed.
Stephanie bristled.
We were ambushed. There was no way.
Jacqueline's hand snapped up, silencing her with a single gesture.
You deserved your defeat. You let them into your mind, let them control you. Do you think yourself a Volkos? Do you think rage will win battles for you? You spat hatred at your enemies as if it were a weapon. I hate you, you said. Childish. Foolish. Weak.
Stephanie clenched her fists, her jaw tight.
I was angry. They had us pinned. What else was I supposed to do?
You are supposed to control yourself. You are House Basilisk now. Our power is in focus, in the void, in stillness, indifference. You fight with your mind, not your emotions.
Jacqueline turned, pacing slowly toward the altar, as her words sank into the silence of the cathedral.
Anger is for the Volkos, for those who burn with fury and chaos. We are the void, cold, silent, absolute.
Stephanie bit back a retort, but the other woman's voice cracked through the air again.
Emotions weaken you. They make you a slave to your enemy.
Jacqueline turned back toward her, her eyes sharp and cold.
Do you want to be a slave, Stephanie?
Stephanie glared back, her defiance smoldering beneath the surface, but she didn't answer.
You will learn control. You will learn the power of the void.
For a moment, there was only the echo of Jacqueline's words in the vast emptiness of the cathedral. Stephanie stood still, her mind reeling with the sharpness of the rebuke. The weight of the moment settled heavily in the church. Stephanie knew that this was no ordinary lesson, Jacqueline wasn't here to simply teach her how to fight. She was here to shape her into something more, something dangerous, something invincible. Jacqueline led Stephanie outside, through the stone corridors and into the open courtyard behind the church. The training ground was lit by flickering torchlight, casting long shadows across the floor. Stephanie looked around, her body still sore from the events that had led to her capture and eventual freedom. Her mind raced as she recalled the defeat by the Midnight Fiends. Anger flickered in her chest, but she quickly buried it. She wasn't about to show weakness in front of her sire again. Jacqueline remained a few paces ahead. There was an air of control about her, an energy that seemed to suck the warmth out of the night itself. She didn't need to look back to know Stephanie was following. Without turning, she spoke.
As I said before, you let your emotions rule you. That is why you failed.
It wasn't just that. They outnumbered us. They had
nothing you couldn't have defeated if you had been still. You handed victory to them.
Jacqueline interrupted, turning sharply to face her. Her gaze pierced through Stephanie as though she could see the turmoil within. The words hit hard, and Stephanie struggled to hold back her retort. Her pride stung at the harsh words.
So what should I have done? Just stood there and let them kill me?
No, you become a void so empty that you devour your opponents whole.
She moved closer, her towering figure casting a long shadow over Stephanie.
You're saying I should fight without emotions? How is that even possible?
It's not only possible, it is necessary. Let me show you.
Without another word, Jacqueline drew her sword, a blade forged of shadow and ice, its edges jagged like the teeth of a frozen beast. Stephanie could feel the cold radiating from it, the sheer power it held. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a manifestation of the void itself.
Draw your weapon.
Stephanie hesitated, unsure if she was even capable of conjuring something like that. But as the tension within her mounted, she focused, drawing upon the shadows around her. She stretched out her hand, and from the darkness a sword began to form, a jagged thing made of the same shadowy void as Jacqueline's, though far less refined. The blade shimmered with an unnatural cold, and Stephanie felt a surge of power as it solidified in her grasp. Without warning, Jacqueline lunged. Her blade moved with an eerie silence, slicing through the air as if it were cutting through the night itself. Stephanie barely had time to react, raising her own weapon just in time to block the strike. The force of it rattled her, and she stumbled back.
Focus.
Jacqueline hissed.
Feel nothing. Be nothing.
Stephanie's instincts screamed at her to retaliate, but her sire's words echoed in her mind. Feel nothing. Be nothing. She tried to center herself, to focus on the emptiness Jacqueline was demanding. She swung her sword, aiming for her opponent's midsection, but her strike was wild, fueled by frustration. Jacqueline parried effortlessly, her blade moving with a calm precision. Each time their blades met, Stephanie could feel her own rage bubbling to the surface. Every miss, every blocked hit stoked the fire within her.
You are angry again.
Jacqueline taunted, her voice low and steady.
I can feel it.
I'm not!
Stephanie growled through gritted teeth, lashing out with more force than before. She pushed herself harder, hoping to break through Jacqueline's defenses. But her every move was countered, every strike dodged or blocked with an ease that infuriated her.
You fight like a child.
Jacqueline said, her voice dripping with disdain.
A child who doesn't understand the true nature of her own power.
Stephanie's grip tightened on her weapon, her frustration boiling over. She swung again, harder this time, and Jacqueline met her blade with a resounding crash that sent a shockwave up Stephanie's arm. The force knocked her off balance, and she stumbled backward, gasping. Jacqueline unleashed a powerful blow that broke through Stephanie's defense. Her sword was shattered in her own hands, and Jacqueline's blade struck with precision, breaking Stephanie's arm. The sound of the bone snapping echoed in the courtyard. Jacqueline's blade was at her throat before she could recover. Stephanie fell to her knees, clutching her broken arm. Pain coursed through her, but more than the physical agony, it was the shame that weighed heavy on her. She had failed again. Jacqueline stood over her, her expression impassive.
You let your emotions rule you once more.
Stephanie gritted her teeth, fighting back frustration.
How do I stop it?
You must empty yourself, Stephanie. Become the void. Only then will you have the power to command the darkness that defines us.
Stephanie looked away, feeling hurt, and Jacqueline picked up on that. The sire tilted her head in realization.
You carry guilt, don't you?
Stephanie looked at her, caught by surprise, and without words to respond for the first time this night.
This is why your emotions are awry. Something causes turmoil inside of you and you can't control it because you are afraid of it. What is it?
Stephanie looked away, feeling exposed, her anger rising.
Spill it, child. Unburden yourself so you can heal and move on. Confess.
Silence followed, but before Jacqueline could demand again, Stephanie spoke, looking at the floor.
I was engaged once. My fiancé, Richard, he was my world. I grew up in a broken home. Dad left for cigarettes and never came back, and Mom was an alcoholic. Suffice to say, I learned to take care of myself really young. Once, I ate a whole jar of peanut butter for Thanksgiving because Mom was too drunk to cook or buy groceries.
She laughed softly to herself.
I met Richard in high school, and boy, I knew he was trouble as soon as I laid eyes on him, and I loved him for that. I never needed help to defend myself, but it was nice to have someone take care of me. He made me feel safe. We dropped out and decided that work was for suckers. We started small. A few convenience store robberies, a bank once. We were like Bonnie and Clyde, armed to the teeth and in love.
Her expression grew dark.
And then, we met Don Vittorio. We stole one of his trucks with contraband cigarettes. For some reason, he liked Richard and decided to bring us to the fold. But in order to do that, Richard would have to do something to kill a man named William Morning in jail. So he got arrested. Vittorio moved him around the penitentiary system and got him to the same cell block as William, and Richard made good on his word. William was dead. One life to save, too.
What does that have to do with anything?
William Morning is Wade's father.
Jacqueline narrowed her eyes, her mind calculating the implications of this information. This had Oppenheimer's fingerprints all over it. It was no coincidence.
Where is Richard now?
Stephanie looked away, a blood tear striking her cheek. Before she answered, she closed her eyes in deep sorrow, forcing more tears to drop on the floor.
I killed him,
she cried, releasing all of her emotions at the same time.
He was my partner, my protector, the only person who ever cared for me, and I killed him to save myself.
Her expression grew ever more darker, the shadows around her coiling and recoiling ominously, reacting to her inner spirit. For a moment, Jacqueline's stoic facade faltered, and her eyes betrayed her, showing surprise.
How did it happen?
We wanted to leave Dreadford, away from Vittorio's grasp. At the time, we were selling his cigarettes, and at a chance, we sold all the product in 2 days, leaving us about 3 to 4 days to deliver payment. So we took the money and bought drugs with the idea to resell it with enough profit to escape town and still pay Vittorio. But we got robbed after the meeting. Some guys in masks and tactical gear stole from us. Vittorio decided that this time someone would have to pay in blood. He left me and Richard in a room with a gun and told us we would have to decide who would pay.
She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, her expression was resolute.
Richard couldn't. He stood there looking at me, his face covered in tears, begging me to do it. He promised me he would never hurt me, and he never did. I, on the other hand, picked that .45 and shot him dead.
She finished, the blood on her face already dry. Silence fell between the sire and child, and only the rustle of leaves and the wind could be heard for a long moment.
How do you feel now?
I feel empty.
Good. Draw your blade again.
Despite the pain, Stephanie looked up at her sire with newfound determination. She had seen the power Jacqueline wielded, felt it in every strike, and now she wanted that power for herself. She needed it. The void inside called for her, and she reached back. The night had grown darker, colder, as the hours slipped away unnoticed during their training. As they both rested, she couldn't help but ask,
How did our house come to wield these powers? Why are we tied to the void?
For a moment, Jacqueline seemed to weigh the question, her usual coldness softening ever so slightly as she glanced at her progeny. Stephanie's curiosity wasn't born of defiance this time. It was genuine, and perhaps that's what swayed Jacqueline to answer.
Very well. You deserve to know where we come from.
Stephanie straightened, intrigued. She hadn't expected Jacqueline to indulge her curiosity.
Our house's power over the void, over darkness and entropy, begins with Kingu, the son of Tiamat, the first of the Nosferatu. Long ago, in the age of myths, when gods and monsters walked the earth, Tiamat sought immortality after her husband, Apsu, was slain by mages. It was a betrayal that set her on a path of vengeance, and Kingu stood by her side, loyal and resolute. Kingu was a nobleman, a ruler of great distinction. Several of his vassals followed him into the darkness alongside Tiamat, forsaking everything in the quest for immortality and revenge. Together, they set out to slay the dragon Nephilim, a powerful being. It was this ritual that would turn Tiamat into the first Nosferatu. When the time came, Tiamat chose Kingu as the first to replicate the ritual. She tasked him with a quest, to seek out the snake Nephilim, the bringer of entropy, chaos, and death. And Kingu went alone to face this great beast.
He killed it?
Stephanie leaned forward, captivated.
He did more than kill it. Kingu consumed the snake. Its power of darkness and void became his. And when he returned to Tiamat, he was no longer merely her son. He had become the first of our house, a being who wielded the void itself. In the battles that followed, Kingu trained tirelessly, preparing for the war that Tiamat would wage against the mages. He became her greatest weapon, a force of pure entropy and silence. When the final reckoning came between the Nosferatu and the mages, Kingu led her armies. His very presence consumed the light from the battlefield, leaving only cold, darkness, and the ruin of those who opposed him.
Stephanie shivered, feeling both awe and fear.
So, that's why we command the void?
Yes, it is our inheritance through Kingu. Our power is tied to the entropy that snakes have embodied throughout mythology, like Apophis, the great serpent of shadow and destruction in Egyptian lore, or the snake in the Garden of Eden who was responsible for the introduction of death and entropy into creation. We are the embodiment of that. Humanity has an allure for the dark, and our blood controls it. We are the darkness that rules over them. After their victory, Tiamat rewarded Kingu. She appointed him as the ruler of mortals, giving him dominion over humanity itself. According to some myths, it is even said that humanity came from his blood. Tiamat reserved for herself the right to rule Nosferatu as their queen, but she trusted only Kingu to guide mortals, and ensured that our house would always hold dominion over them. Also, Kingu was one of the few whom Tiamat trusted to ask for counsel, and he became her vizier and advisor. Tiamat's final gift to her son was the Tablets of Destiny, a source of forbidden knowledge, corrupted by his powers over the void. For centuries, he studied them, his abilities growing as he unraveled the secrets of existence itself. His connection to the void deepened, and with it, his understanding of the universe's endless collapse into entropy. Kingu's powers became unparalleled, but with that power came a greater obsession, one that consumed him as surely as the void itself. This is the power you are training to inherit, Stephanie. Kingu's blood flows through your veins just as it does mine. You must learn to control it, or it will consume you.
I won't fail. I'll become what I'm meant to be.
Jacqueline nodded before continuing.
There were 4 of his children who survived the fall of the Tower of Babel and carried Kingu's legacy forward. The Babelites of our house. The Voidwalker, which represented the absolute emptiness and endlessness of the void. He was a nihilistic figure who embraced the universe's collapse into entropy, seeing it as an inevitable end. The Sovereign, who embodied our house's destiny to rule over mortals, regal and commanding. It was said he exerted an irresistible obedience and control in those he encountered. The Templar, who acted as our house's sacred and ruthless enforcer, who froze entire armies and shattered them like brittle ice. And finally, the White Serpent, which represented the insidious nature of darkness, not just as an absence, but as a force that corrupts and consumes. It is said this vampire traveled to the east, and one of his children is responsible for the house being called House Orochi there. We in Dreadford are descended from the Sovereign.
As Jacqueline continued her recounting of House Basilisk's ancient history, she shifted her gaze toward a corner where shadows seemed to stretch and writhe as if animated by her words.
After the fall of the Tower of Babel and the end of the Age of the Founders, the world of the Nosferatu was fractured. Our house, House Kingu, found itself embroiled in an unending feud with House Dracula. As the organization that would become the Tower was formed, it was surrounded by these early rivalries. Both houses accused the other of having invaded the domain that belonged to itself. Dracula started ruling over mortals and basilisks over Nosferatu. Thus began the conflict that would last for millennia. It was not always a war of armies, but also of whispers, of assassinations, of the slow erosion of power across generations. As we spread our influence, our house found fertile ground in the ancient lands of Egypt, where serpents were revered as figures of royalty. Our bloodlines thrived under the rule of the pharaohs, and we watched, from the shadows, as kingdoms rose and fell. Our power, you see, was never overt. We thrived by turning the wheels of history from behind the veil. Eventually, we also spread to Persia, where darkness was associated with Ahriman, the great adversary. There we fought fiercely with the Dracul. Each house manipulated kings, priests, and generals to further their agendas. But it was during this time that our house began to evolve. It was no longer enough to be mere shadows, whispering in the ears of mortal rulers. The time came for us to rise. This evolution came at the time of Alexander the Great. Alexander was a mortal ruler unlike any the world had seen, a man whose ambition knew no limits, whose empire stretched from Greece to the edges of India. It was then that one of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy I Soter, came into contact with the gift of Babylon. He was a man of incredible ambition, even among mortals, and when offered the chance to ascend beyond humanity, he took it without hesitation. Ptolemy was turned by one of our most ancient, a basilisk who saw in him the potential to shape the future. And so, Ptolemy became Nosferatu, a descendant of Kingu, and his rule over Egypt began. The Ptolemaic dynasty was born, and with it, our house entered a new era. The name Basilisk, meaning kinglet, or small king, was born during this time. It symbolized Ptolemy's relationship to Alexander, as he ruled over Egypt in the conqueror's stead, but also spoke to our house's role in relation to Tiamat and Kingu. We were no longer House Kingu, content to lurk in the shadows. We were now House Basilisk, small kings in the mortal world, ruling not through overt conquest, but through the terrifying powers we possessed. It was during this time that Ptolemy discovered and honed one of our house's most fearsome abilities, the Eye of the Basilisk. With a single glance, Ptolemy could kill mortals, freezing their hearts with terror. It became the defining power of our bloodline, and those who crossed House Basilisk soon learned to fear the gaze of our members.
Stephanie shivered slightly, imagining the deadly power.
Ptolemy's dynasty flourished for centuries, but as the mortal world changed, so too did the Nosferatu. As empires fell and new powers rose, our house spread its influence across Europe, weaving into the fabric of medieval kingdoms. And from those darkened halls of power emerged one of Ptolemy's most infamous progeny, Mordred, the Black Knight.
Mordred, as in King Arthur's Mordred?
Indeed. The stories of King Arthur, or Coriolis as we know him, are fraught with myth and legend, but at their core is a tale of conflict between two great vampiric factions. Mordred, like Ptolemy before him, inherited the Eye of the Basilisk, and his reign was one of terror and strength. He fought fiercely against the king's court, the rival faction that sought to impose a new model of rulership over the Nosferatu. In the final battle, as the king's court rose to power, Mordred was said to have been defeated, but there are whispers. Some say he survived. Some say that Mordred never died, but instead went into hiding, plotting from the shadows to bring down the king's court and the Round Table.
As Jacqueline finished her recounting of the feud between House Basilisk and House Dracul and the rise of their house, Stephanie remained still, absorbing the weight of the ancient conflicts. Jacqueline observed her pupil for a moment before continuing.
You've asked about the history, but there's more to our legacy than just battles and kingdoms. There are stories of individuals, those whose lives or unlives shaped the very foundation of our house. Let me tell you about one of them. Carmilla, whose name you may know, though she was born as Mircalla Karnstein.
Stephanie tilted her head slightly, intrigued.
Carmilla? The Carmilla from the old stories? I thought she was just a legend.
Legends are often built on truth. And in our world, those truths tend to be far darker and more fascinating than any mortal could imagine. Mircalla Karnstein was born into a family of nobility in Styria, around the late 16th century. Her life as a mortal was one of wealth and privilege, but it was also one filled with isolation. The Karnsteins were known for their reclusive nature, and their lands, surrounded by dark forests, always carried an air of mystery. There were rumors, of course, whispers that the Karnstein line was cursed, that the women of the family were all touched by darkness. But none of those rumors were entirely true until Mircalla came of age. She was a beautiful young woman, quiet yet filled with a cold, insatiable curiosity about the world. She often wandered the forests surrounding her family's estate, drawn to the shadows as though they whispered her name. It was during one of these wanderings that she encountered a stranger, a nobleman, pale and regal, who seemed to melt out of the darkness itself. He was no ordinary man, of course. He was one of our house, a member of House Basilisk, and he had come to her for a reason.
Why her? What made her so special?
Mircalla was marked by the blood of serpents long before she became one of us. Her lineage, though mortal, had roots that stretched deep into ancient bloodlines, lines that carried a faint trace of the void within them. The nobleman saw in her the potential to carry our house forward, to strengthen the bloodline with her inherent darkness, and so one night he offered her the gift of Babylon.
And she accepted?
Not at first. Mircalla was no fool. She understood the gravity of the offer and hesitated, knowing that accepting it would sever her ties to the mortal world forever. But the allure of power, of the unknown, was too strong, and in that moment, the void embraced her. Mircalla Karnstein died, and Carmilla was born. Carmilla, newly transformed, was taken under the nobleman's wing. He taught her the ways of our house, instructing her in the arts of void and entropy. But her true strength was something else entirely. It was in the way she moved through the world, a predator wrapped in the guise of an innocent girl. She learned quickly that while power can be wielded overtly, true control is often more subtle. She wandered the courts of Europe, never aging, always beguiling those around her with her beauty and grace. She was a seductress, a queen in the shadows. But beneath her charming exterior was the cold, calculating mind of a predator. Her power, much like that of the basilisk, lay in her gaze. Many claimed that Carmilla could kill with a single look, that her eyes held the power to freeze a man's soul or cause his heart to stop with fear.
Stephanie's eyes widened.
Like Ptolemy with the eye of the basilisk?
Exactly. Carmilla was a true descendant of Kingu, and through her blood she wielded the same terrifying ability. Over time, she perfected her craft, and her legend spread throughout the lands. Many of her victims fell in love with her, only to be devoured slowly over weeks, months, until their vitality drained entirely. But she wasn't just a killer, she was a ruler. Wherever she went, Carmilla established control, often without anyone realizing it. Entire noble houses crumbled at her whim, and the mortals around her were none the wiser.
But what happened to her? If she was so powerful, why isn't she ruling today?
Stephanie asked, clearly drawn in by the tale.
Carmilla's downfall was orchestrated by the Dracul, some say by Dracula himself.
Dracula?
Yes. In her rise to power, she chiseled away part of his territory and influence, so he would use her own habits to bring her ruin.
How?
Carmilla had a very unorthodox method of feeding. She would appear in a nobleman's house, befriend their daughters, and feed from them until they died. One of these noblemen was approached by the Order of St. George, a group of vampire hunters, and her true nature was revealed to him, and also how he could take up arms and seek revenge.
And how does Dracula fit in this?
The Order of St. George is known to be the Dragon Slayers, Dracul Slayers, and they are Dracula's sworn enemies, and he is known to put his enemies to fight among themselves in order to keep their attention away from him, using an enemy's knife to destroy another. It's his signature, an oeuvre, if you will, a way to slightly nod to those who have eyes to see.
Smart. So she was destroyed?
No, she escaped, but her secret was revealed and she had to hide. But she's still out there waiting.
The story of Carmilla gave Stephanie some pause. Was Oppenheimer doing the same to her? Pre-planning strife in her crew in order to keep them divided so he could better manipulate them? She did not know. Jacqueline continued, bringing her child back to the present.
Perhaps she will return with all the fury and power of House Basilisk. Carmilla is a sleeping giant, and her reappearance would change the balance of power once more. But whether that is a blessing or a curse remains to be seen.
I wonder what she would think of our world now.
Jacqueline tilted her head, watching her pupil carefully.
Perhaps one day you'll have the chance to ask her. As for us here in Dreadford, our progenitor and first Nosferatu of our blood is Gaius de Lucis. He was a child of Mordred and was one of the Nosferatu who started the tower here. For centuries, he waged a brutal war against the king's court for control over the city. His enemies, allies, and children feared him. He only delivered the gift of Babylon to his mortal descendants, the de Lucis family, and no one else. That was his rule. He broke it only once, much to his regret. My sire, Hernan de Lucis, was his eldest vampiric progeny, and did not follow the rule of his own sire. Until very recently, Gaius was one of the two hierophants leading the tower and our house, but he is no more. Now our house is led by a child of his, Antoinette de Lucis.
What happened to him?
Gaius met the due reward for his actions.
The cryptic nature of the answer left Stephanie unsettled. She could sense the layers of history, betrayal, and dark consequences behind Jacqueline's words. There were things she was not yet ready to know, and perhaps things Jacqueline would never tell her. Stephanie shifted in the silence, eager to push her thoughts away from the mysteries surrounding Gaius.
I'm still amazed that you can trace your bloodline back so long, all the way to Ptolemy.
Jacqueline nodded slightly.
The blood remembers.
They fell into a comfortable silence, focusing again on the training exercises they had been working on. She could feel the darkness within her coiling, responding to her command, becoming sharper and more refined. There was a satisfaction in mastering it, knowing that her powers were growing.
You're learning quickly.
Jacqueline observed, her voice quiet but approving.
But the greatest challenge for a basilisk is not the mastering of power. It is resisting the pull of entropy. We are creatures of death and cold. It is easy to become a mere agent of those forces, rather than their master.
Stephanie smirked, amused by the solemnity in Jacqueline's words.
You once told me not to call you mother. I understand why, but I need to say this. I never had anything easy in my life. No one ever taught me anything without demanding a heavy price in return. But you've given me far more than I ever deserved. I think it's fair to say that you're the closest thing to a mother I've ever had.
Stephanie's words hung in the air as she stood up, her expression a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. After a long pause, Stephanie cleared her throat, hesitating for a moment before speaking.
You're so serious, always talking about resisting entropy. I've noticed you're quite religious too. Why are you here in the tower if you have so much faith?
I learned from my twin sister that faith is not just about belief, it is about service. A person of faith accepts that they are a tool for higher purposes. We are where we are most needed, not where we choose to be. My sister never lost her faith, even when we were both turned into Nosferatu by our sire. She saw it as a calling, a mission.
Is your sister still alive?
Jacqueline looked away, the coldness in her eyes hardening even further.
No, she walks no more. The court destroyed her.